The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace as Guardsman James Mitchell adjusted his iconic red tunic and checked his rifle one final time. At 28 years old, James had served in the Queen's Guard for 6 years, and the weight of tradition rested heavily on his shoulders. The black bearskin hat, standing 18 inches tall, had become as familiar to him as his own reflection. Today would mark his 2,147th day of duty, a number he kept track of with quiet pride. The rules were absolute and non-negotiable. Stand perfectly still, eyes forward, no speaking, no moving, no acknowledgement of tourists, no matter how persistent they became. These weren't just guidelines, they were sacred protocols that had been followed for centuries. James had seen fellow guards disciplined for the smallest infractions, a twitch of the eye, a shift of weight, even the hint of a smile. The Queen's Guard represented the unwavering strength and dignity of the British monarchy, and that representation demanded perfection. James positioned himself at his designated post outside the palace gates, his polished black boots finding their familiar marks on the stone. The morning tourist crowd was already beginning to gather, cameras clicking and phones recording. He had learned to tune out the constant chatter, the attempts to make him laugh, the occasional rude gestures designed to provoke a reaction. His mind had developed the ability to exist in a state of focused meditation while remaining completely alert to any genuine security threats. The Coldstream Guards, his regiment, had protected British royalty since 1650. The privilege of wearing the uniform came with expectations that extended far beyond the physical demands of standing motionless for hours. Each guard underwent rigorous training, not just in military protocol, but in the art of becoming a living statue. They learned to breathe quietly, to blink minimally, and to maintain composure under the most challenging circumstances. As the morning progressed, James watched the familiar parade of tourists through his peripheral vision. School groups squealed with delight as they posed for photos. Business travelers hurried past with barely a glance. Elderly couples pointed and whispered about the guards they remembered from their youth. Street performers set up nearby, adding their music to the constant urban symphony of London traffic and human voices. Around mid-morning, something unusual caught James's attention. A small group was approaching, moving more slowly than the typical tourist clusters. His training had taught him to identify potential threats through subtle observations. And while this group posed no danger, they definitely stood out. A man and woman, both in their 30s, walked carefully beside a little girl who couldn't have been more than 6 years old. The child moved with obvious difficulty, her small hand gripping a colorful walker decorated with cartoon characters. Her head was covered by a bright pink knitted cap that couldn't quite hide the fact that she had no hair underneath. Even from a distance, James could see the pale complexion and fragile appearance that spoke of serious illness. The parents' faces carried that particular mixture of hope and exhaustion that he had seen before on the faces of families dealing with medical crises. The little girl's name was Emma Thompson, though James wouldn't learn this until much later. She was 5 years old and had been battling acute lymphoblastic leukemia for 8 months. The chemotherapy had taken her beautiful blonde curls, her energy, and much of her childhood joy, but it hadn't diminished her spirit. Emma had been fascinated by princesses and castles for as long as she could remember, and seeing the real palace guards had been her greatest wish during their family trip to London. Her parents, David and Sarah Thompson, had saved for 2 years to afford this vacation. When Emma was diagnosed, they had almost canceled the trip. But the doctors encouraged them to go ahead with their plans. The treatment was going well, they said, and Emma needed something positive to look forward to. The Make-A-Wish Foundation had even helped arrange special access to certain areas of the palace grounds. As the family drew closer to James's position, he could hear the little girl's excited whispers. "Mummy, look how tall he is. Is that a real soldier?" Does he live in the castle with the queen?" Her voice carried the breathless wonder that only children possess, and despite his training, James felt something stir in his chest. He had never been married, had no children of his own, but something about the courage in that small voice touched him deeply. The protocol was clear: no interaction, no acknowledgement, no deviation from duty. James had followed these rules perfectly for 6 years. He had maintained his position during thunderstorms, heat waves, and even when a tourist had accidentally spilled hot coffee near his feet. He had stood motionless when protesters shouted inches from his face, when children tugged at his uniform, when adults made inappropriate comments about his appearance. Emma's family positioned themselves about 10 feet away from James's post. The little girl stared up at him with enormous blue eyes, her expression filled with a mixture of awe and curiosity. She whispered something to her mother, who knelt down and whispered back. The conversation continued for several minutes, with Emma pointing occasionally at different aspects of James's uniform: the brass buttons, the red fabric, the imposing bearskin hat. Sarah Thompson pulled out her phone and began taking pictures of Emma standing near the guard. The little girl posed carefully, her pink hat bright against the backdrop of the historic palace. She tried different positions, sometimes serious and sometimes grinning widely, but always keeping a respectful distance. It was clear that her parents had educated her about the importance of not disturbing the guards. After about 15 minutes of photos, Emma approached slightly closer to James's position. She stood directly in front of him, her small face upturned to meet his gaze. For a long moment, she simply studied him with the intense concentration that children bring to things that fascinate them. James could see every detail of her condition now: the dark circles under her bright eyes, the medical bracelet on her tiny wrist, the way she favored her left leg when standing. "Hello, Mr. Guard," Emma said softly, her voice barely audible above the street noise. "My name is Emma. I'm 5 years old and I have cancer, but I'm getting better. Mummy says you protect the Queen. That must be very important work. I think you're very brave." The words hit James like a physical blow. In all his years of service, no one had ever spoken to him with such genuine respect and understanding. Most people treated the guards as curiosities, living statues to be photographed and sometimes mocked. But this little girl, facing a battle that would challenge the strongest adults, had recognized something in his duty that even he sometimes forgot: the honor and courage required to serve something greater than oneself. James felt his carefully constructed composure beginning to crack. The training that had become second nature, the ability to remain unmoved by any external stimulus, suddenly seemed inadequate in the face of such pure honesty from a child who was fighting for her life. His chest tightened, and he had to concentrate harder than usual to maintain his breathing pattern. Emma continued to stand there, waiting patiently, as if she somehow understood that his silence wasn't rudeness, but responsibility. Her parents watched from a short distance, ready to intervene if their daughter was bothering the guard, but also recognizing something special in the moment. Other tourists had begun to notice the scene, and a small crowd was forming, cameras ready to capture whatever might happen next. The weight of protocol pressed down on James like a physical force. 6 years of perfect service. 6 years of unwavering discipline. 6 years of proving himself worthy of the uniform and the trust it represented. His superiors had made it clear that any deviation from established procedures would result in immediate disciplinary action, possible demotion, or even dismissal from the guard. But as James looked down at Emma's upturned face, he saw something that transcended rules and regulations. He saw courage that put his own daily discipline to shame. He saw a spirit that refused to be diminished by circumstances beyond her control. He saw the kind of pure human connection that his uniform was supposed to protect and serve, not ignore. The moment stretched on, suspended between duty and humanity, between protocol and compassion. James could feel the eyes of the growing crowd, could sense the anticipation building as people began to realize they might be witnessing something unprecedented. His fellow guards at nearby posts remained motionless, but he knew they were aware of the situation developing at his position. Emma shifted slightly, her small hand reaching up as if she wanted to touch the red fabric of his tunic, but stopping herself. "I know you can't talk to me," she whispered, "but I wanted to say thank you for keeping everyone safe. When I grow up, I want to be brave like you." The innocence of her words, the genuine gratitude in her voice, and the unconscious wisdom of her restraint combined to create a moment that James knew would stay with him forever. This little girl, fighting the greatest battle of her young life, had found the strength to thank him for doing his job. The irony wasn't lost on him. She was showing more courage in her daily existence than he demonstrated standing at attention for hours. Something fundamental shifted inside James in that moment. The rigid adherence to protocol that had defined his service began to feel less like strength and more like limitation. The rules he had followed so perfectly suddenly seemed inadequate to address the real meaning of service, protecting and honoring the people who made his duty worthwhile. The crowd around them had grown larger, sensing that they were witnessing something significant. Phones were recording, cameras were clicking, but James had stopped noticing the external pressure. His entire focus was on the small girl standing before him, whose presence had somehow managed to penetrate 6 years of carefully constructed professional armor. Emma's mother approached cautiously, ready to collect her daughter and move on with their visit. She could see that other tourists were becoming restless, eager for their own photo opportunities. But as she reached for Emma's hand, the little girl looked up at her with pleading eyes. "Just one more minute, Mummy? Please?" Sarah Thompson glanced up at the motionless guard, trying to read any sign of irritation or discomfort in his expression. What she saw instead was something that surprised her, an intensity of focus that seemed entirely directed toward her daughter. The guard's eyes, which she had assumed were staring straight ahead at nothing, were clearly fixed on Emma's face. As the first document of this story ends, James Mitchell stood at the crossroads of his career, faced with a choice that would define not just his remaining time in the Queen's Guard, but his understanding of what it truly meant to serve. The little girl before him had unknowingly presented him with a test that no training manual had prepared him for. The test of choosing between rigid adherence to rules and the human spirit that those rules were meant to protect. The decision came to James Mitchell in a flash of clarity that surprised him with its simplicity. 6 years of rigid training seemed to evaporate as he looked down at Emma Thompson's hopeful face. The little girl who had traveled hundreds of miles while battling cancer deserved more than his silence. She deserved recognition of her courage, acknowledgement of her spirit, and validation that her gratitude had been heard. Very slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, James began to lower himself into a crouch. The movement was so gradual that the watching crowd didn't immediately realize what was happening. His knees bent centimeter by centimeter, his body maintaining perfect posture even as he descended from his rigid standing position. The red tunic remained crisp, the brass buttons caught the sunlight, and his expression never wavered from its professional composure. Emma's eyes widened as the enormous guard began to shrink down toward her level. Her small hands flew to her mouth in amazement, and she took a tiny step backward, not from fear, but from sheer surprise. The other tourists fell silent as they began to understand that they were witnessing something extraordinary, a Queen's Guard breaking centuries of protocol. When James reached Emma's eye level, he stopped. They were face to face now, this battle-hardened soldier and this 5-year-old warrior. For a moment, neither moved. Emma's blue eyes searched his face with wonder, while James saw reflected back at him a strength that humbled him completely. Without speaking a word, they had found a connection that transcended duty, rules, and circumstance. Then Emma did something that would later become the defining image of the entire encounter. She reached up with one small hand and gently touched the side of James's face, just below his bearskin hat. Her touch was feather-light, reverent, as if she was blessing him rather than seeking comfort for herself. The gesture was so natural, so completely innocent, that it took everyone's breath away. James felt tears threatening for the first time since his childhood. The warmth of that small hand against his cheek broke through every barrier he had constructed over years of military service. This wasn't about protocol anymore. This wasn't about rules or regulations or the consequences that would surely follow. This was about recognizing pure human goodness when it stood before him and honoring it in the only way he could. Maintaining his crouched position, James carefully reached into his tunic and withdrew something that made the crowd gasp. It was a small metal button from his uniform. Not one of the large, visible brass ones that tourists always photographed, but a smaller, more personal one from inside his jacket. These buttons were replaceable and technically personal property rather than official Crown equipment. With movements as precise as his guard duties, James placed the button gently in Emma's open palm. Her fingers closed around it immediately, as if she understood the preciousness of the gift. The metal was warm from his body heat, and Emma held it against her chest like a treasure beyond price. "For your bravery," James whispered, his voice so quiet that only Emma could hear him. 3 words that broke 6 years of silence, 3 words that acknowledged what everyone could see, but few had the courage to say, that this little girl was the bravest person in that crowd. Emma's face transformed with joy so pure that several onlookers began crying openly. She looked down at the button in her hands, then back up at James's face, then at the button again. When she finally spoke, her voice carried across the suddenly silent courtyard. "This is the best present ever. I'm going to keep it forever and ever, and when I'm all better, I'll come back and show you, okay?" The promise hit James harder than any order he had ever received. When she was all better, not if, but when. This child, facing a disease that terrified grown adults, spoke about her recovery with absolute certainty. Her faith in her own future was unshakable, and she was already planning to return to share her victory with him. James nodded once, a slight but unmistakable movement that sent ripples of emotion through the watching crowd. It was another breach of protocol, but it seemed insignificant compared to what had already transpired. Emma clutched her button and threw her arms around James's neck in a hug that lasted only seconds but felt like a lifetime. The cameras that had been clicking constantly suddenly seemed irrelevant. This wasn't a photo opportunity anymore. It was a sacred moment between 2 people who had found something precious in each other. Emma's parents stood frozen, tears streaming down their faces as they witnessed their daughter receiving validation for her courage from someone who understood the true meaning of bravery. When Emma released her embrace, James slowly returned to his full standing position. The transformation back to his guard stance was as gradual and controlled as his descent had been, but something fundamental had changed. The same uniform, the same posture, the same professional bearing, but now there was a warmth behind his eyes that hadn't been there before. Emma stepped back and executed a perfect little curtsy, the kind she had practiced for weeks in anticipation of possibly meeting royalty. "Thank you, Mr. Guard. I'll never forget you ever." As the Thompson family began to move on with their visit, the crowd that had gathered remained unusually subdued. There was none of the usual chatter and excitement that followed tourist encounters with the guards. Instead, people seemed to recognize that they had witnessed something sacred, something that transcended the ordinary boundaries of duty and protocol. Word of the incident spread with remarkable speed. Within hours, photos and videos of James kneeling before Emma were circulating on social media platforms around the world. The story captured imaginations everywhere, a symbol of compassion triumphing over rigid rules, of humanity asserting itself in the most unlikely circumstances. But the immediate consequences for James were far from positive. Within 2 hours of the encounter, he was summoned to his commanding officer's chambers. Captain Robert Hartwell had served in the Guards for over 20 years and had never seen anything like the reports crossing his desk. Videos of the incident were already viral, and Buckingham Palace was receiving inquiries from news organizations around the globe. "Guardsman Mitchell," Captain Hartwell began, his voice carrying the weight of institutional authority, "I'm sure you're aware of the seriousness of what occurred today. Breaking protocol in such a public manner, regardless of the circumstances, cannot go unaddressed. The Queen's Guard maintains its effectiveness through absolute adherence to established procedures." James stood at attention, his face revealing nothing of the internal conflict raging within him. He knew that disciplinary action was inevitable. He had knowingly violated direct orders, and there could be no excuse that would satisfy military justice. The question wasn't whether he would face consequences, but what form those consequences would take. "However," Captain Hartwell continued, and James detected a slight softening in his tone, "the situation presents certain complexities. The public response has been overwhelmingly positive. The palace has received hundreds of calls and emails praising your actions. Several high-ranking officials have specifically requested that any disciplinary measures take into account the exceptional nature of the circumstances." James remained silent, as protocol demanded. But internally, he was struggling with feelings he couldn't quite categorize. Relief mixed with apprehension, pride battled with regret. And underneath it all was the persistent image of Emma's face when she had received his button. The investigation that followed was thorough and, surprisingly, sympathetic. James's service record was exemplary: 6 years without a single infraction, commendations for exceptional duty during state ceremonies, and glowing recommendations from every superior he had served under. Character witnesses spoke of his dedication, his integrity, and his deep respect for the institution he served. Meanwhile, the story of Emma Thompson's battle with cancer was becoming public knowledge. News organizations had tracked down her family, and with their permission were sharing updates on her treatment progress. The button that James had given her had become a talisman of hope, something she carried to every medical appointment and chemotherapy session. Dr. Patricia Williams, Emma's oncologist, was quoted in several articles about the psychological impact of positive experiences on pediatric cancer patients. Children fighting serious illnesses often struggle with feelings of powerlessness and isolation, she explained. When someone they admire validates their courage and treats them as heroes rather than victims, it can have profound therapeutic effects. The medical team treating Emma reported that her spirits had improved dramatically following the encounter with James. She spoke constantly about her guard friend and showed her button to every doctor, nurse, and visitor who would listen. Her parents credited the experience with giving Emma renewed determination to complete her treatment successfully. 3 weeks after the incident, James received an unexpected summons, not to a disciplinary hearing, but to a private meeting with Colonel Sir Marcus Pemberton, the commanding officer of the entire household division. The colonel was a decorated veteran with 40 years of military service, and his opinion would carry significant weight in determining James's future. "Guardsman Mitchell," the colonel began, settling into his chair across from James, "your actions 3 weeks ago have created quite a stir. I've reviewed every report, watched every video, and read every comment from the public. I've also had extensive conversations with your immediate superiors and with representatives from Buckingham Palace itself." James prepared himself for the worst. Dismissal from the Guard would end the career he had worked so hard to build. Everything he had achieved over 6 years of faithful service could be erased by one moment of personal decision over professional duty. What you did was unquestionably a violation of standing orders, Colonel Pemberton continued. No argument can be made otherwise. However, the question before us isn't whether rules were broken, but whether the circumstances justified the breaking of those rules. The colonel stood and walked to the window overlooking the palace grounds, his hands clasped behind his back in a gesture James recognized from his own hours of standing duty. The Queen's Guard exists to protect and serve the crown and, by extension, the people of this realm. Our protocols exist to ensure that service is rendered effectively and with dignity. But sometimes, Guardsman Mitchell, the most dignified service requires us to step beyond the boundaries of protocol. James felt his heart begin to race, hardly daring to hope that the conversation was heading in a positive direction. Yesterday, the colonel continued, turning back to face James, I received a personal letter from Her Majesty the Queen herself. She had seen the videos of your encounter with young Emma Thompson. Would you like to know what the Queen's message said? James nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. Her Majesty wrote, and I quote, "The highest honor of the crown is to recognize and protect the courage of its people, especially the youngest and most vulnerable. Guardsman Mitchell exemplified that honor perfectly." The words hung in the air like a blessing, and James felt his knees weaken with relief and overwhelming gratitude. There will be no disciplinary action, Guardsman Mitchell. Instead, you are being commended for exceptional service above and beyond the call of duty. Your actions demonstrated exactly the kind of judgment and character we want in the Queen's Guard. As the second document concludes, James Mitchell stood transformed by an experience that had tested every principle he thought he understood about duty, service, and the meaning of true courage. The little girl who had approached him with nothing but gratitude and admiration had inadvertently taught him that the highest form of protocol is the protocol of the heart. 6 months after his encounter with Emma Thompson, James Mitchell stood at his familiar post outside Buckingham Palace, but everything about his service had fundamentally changed. The uniform was the same, the duties identical, and the protocols unchanged, yet he carried himself with a new understanding of what it meant to serve. The commendation from the Queen herself had been framed and hung in his quarters, but more importantly, it had freed him to embrace a more human interpretation of his role as a guardian. The story of Emma and the Guard had taken on a life of its own, spreading far beyond London and inspiring people around the world. Letters arrived daily at the palace, addressed simply to the Guard who knelt for Emma. Children battling their own illnesses sent drawings of red-coated soldiers. Parents shared stories of how the video had helped them explain courage and kindness to their own children. International media had dubbed him the Guardian Angel, a title that embarrassed him but also reminded him daily of the responsibility he now carried. Emma's treatment had progressed remarkably well. The Thompson family had maintained contact with James through official palace channels, sending regular updates about her recovery. The little girl's oncology team reported that her positive attitude and determination had contributed significantly to her response to chemotherapy. Dr. Williams had even presented a case study at a pediatric oncology conference, exploring the psychological benefits of meaningful recognition for young patients. The button that James had given Emma had become legendary in its own right. She carried it everywhere, refusing to be separated from it even during medical procedures. The small piece of metal had been featured in magazine articles about the power of hope, and replicas were being sold with proceeds donated to childhood cancer research. Emma herself had appeared on several television programs, always clutching her treasured button and speaking with wisdom that amazed adults. James had requested and received permission to write personal letters to Emma, carefully reviewed by palace protocol officers, but allowed to maintain their genuine, heartfelt nature. In his letters, he shared stories about his daily duties, described the changing of the guard ceremonies, and always emphasized how proud he was of her continued bravery. Emma's responses, dictated to her mother and written in a child's careful handwriting, were filled with updates about her treatment, her dreams for the future, and her unwavering intention to visit him again when she was completely well. The impact of their story had reached the highest levels of British society. The Prince of Wales himself had made a public statement about the importance of recognizing everyday heroes, specifically mentioning both Emma's courage and James's compassionate response. Childhood cancer charities reported unprecedented increases in donations, with many contributors specifically citing the Guard and Emma's story as their inspiration. Within the Guards regiment itself, the incident had sparked important conversations about the balance between tradition and humanity. New guidelines had been quietly established, acknowledging that exceptional circumstances might occasionally warrant exceptional responses. While the core protocols remained unchanged, there was now official recognition that true service sometimes required individual judgment and courage. James had become something of a mentor to younger Guards, sharing his experience and helping them understand that their role extended beyond mere ceremony. He spoke often about the responsibility they carried as symbols of stability and protection, emphasizing that their true strength came not from their ability to remain motionless, but from their commitment to the people they served. On a crisp October morning, exactly 8 months after their first meeting, James received the message he had been hoping for. Emma Thompson was officially in remission. Her last round of chemotherapy had been completed successfully, and her medical team was confident about her long-term prognosis. More importantly for James, the Thompson family was planning a return visit to London to celebrate Emma's recovery. The palace had arranged something unprecedented, a private meeting between Emma and James, away from the crowds and cameras that had made their first encounter so public. The Queen herself had approved the use of a private courtyard where the two could reconnect without the pressure of protocol or publicity. It would be the first time James had been officially authorized to speak freely with a member of the public while in uniform. The day of their reunion, James felt nervous in a way that no ceremonial duty had ever made him feel. This wasn't about following procedures or maintaining composure. This was about honoring a promise to a little girl who had kept her part of the bargain by getting well. He had spent weeks planning what he would say, how he would acknowledge her victory over cancer, but as the moment approached, he realized that words would probably be inadequate. Emma arrived looking transformed. Her hair had grown back in soft brown curls, and the pallor that had marked her illness had been replaced by the healthy glow of a normal 6-year-old. She wore a bright yellow dress and carried a small purse that, James knew, contained the button he had given her 8 months earlier. Her parents looked years younger, the stress and fear of the cancer battle replaced by joy and relief. When Emma saw James standing in the courtyard, she broke into a run that would have been impossible during their first meeting. Her energy was boundless, her movements quick and confident. She launched herself into his arms with the enthusiasm that only a healthy, happy child could muster. "Mr. Guard! Mr. Guard! I told you I would come back when I was all better." Emma's voice carried across the courtyard with pure triumph. "Look at my hair! Look how fast I can run! I'm completely well now!" James caught her easily, his formal composure dissolving completely as he held the little girl who had changed his understanding of courage. "Emma, you look wonderful. You kept your promise. You came back stronger and braver than ever." For the next hour, they talked freely. Emma showed him the button, now polished to a brilliant shine and carefully preserved in a special box. She told him about her treatment, about the other children she had met in the hospital, and about how she had shared his story with every new patient she encountered. She had become something of a celebrity in the pediatric oncology ward, inspiring other children with her tale of the Guard who had recognized her bravery. James listened with amazement as this 6-year-old described comforting children older than herself, sharing her button with scared patients, and maintaining hope during the darkest moments of treatment. She had taken the validation he had given her and multiplied it, becoming a source of strength for others facing similar battles. "I want to be a doctor when I grow up," Emma announced with the certainty that children bring to their dreams. "I want to help other kids who are sick like I was. And I want to tell them about you, about how you showed me that being brave means different things for different people." The wisdom of her words struck James profoundly. This child, who had faced death before her 7th birthday, had learned lessons about courage and service that most adults never discovered. She had understood intuitively what he was still learning, that true bravery wasn't about following rules perfectly, but about recognizing when human compassion demanded that rules be transcended. Before their visit ended, Emma had a surprise for James. She had worked with her parents to create a small gift, a framed photograph of herself in her hospital bed, holding his button and smiling despite the IV tubes and medical equipment surrounding her. On the back, she had written in her careful child's handwriting, "Thank you for helping me remember I was brave. Love, Emma." James accepted the gift with hands that trembled slightly. The image captured everything he had hoped for when he had made his decision to break protocol, proof that recognizing someone's courage could help sustain them through their darkest moments. Emma's smile in that hospital bed was radiant with the knowledge that someone believed in her strength. As the Thompson family prepared to leave, Emma made another promise. She would continue visiting James as she grew up, sharing her progress and her dreams. She wanted him to be part of her story, just as she had become part of his. The connection forged in a moment of pure human recognition had grown into something permanent and profound. The months that followed brought James opportunities he had never imagined. He was invited to speak at medical conferences about the psychological impact of recognition on healing. He participated in charity events for childhood cancer research. He became an unofficial ambassador for the idea that strength and compassion were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of true service. Emma's story continued to inspire as well. She started a foundation called Buttons of Bravery that provided small gifts and recognition to children facing serious illnesses. The concept was simple but powerful. Acknowledge the courage that children display every day in their battles against disease, pain, and fear. The foundation grew rapidly, supported by donations from around the world and staffed by volunteers who understood the transformative power of validation. Years later, when James reflected on the encounter that had changed his life, he realized that Emma had given him far more than he had given her. She had taught him that true protocol wasn't about rigid adherence to rules, but about serving the highest values those rules were meant to protect. She had shown him that courage came in many forms, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was to recognize bravery in others. The little girl who had approached him with nothing but gratitude and wonder had revolutionized his understanding of service, duty, and the meaning of protection. In breaking protocol for her, he had discovered a more authentic way to honor everything his uniform represented. Emma Thompson had reminded him that behind every rule, every tradition, and every ceremony, there were real people deserving of recognition, respect, and love. Today, James Mitchell continues to serve in the Queen's Guard, but his service is informed by a deeper understanding of why tradition matters and when it must bend to accommodate the greater truths of human dignity and compassion. Emma's button sits in a place of honor in his quarters, a daily reminder that the most important protocol of all is the protocol of the heart. Emma Thompson, now a healthy, vibrant young woman pursuing her dream of becoming a pediatric oncologist, carries her own button everywhere she goes. It serves as a reminder not just of her victory over cancer, but of the moment when a stranger recognized her courage and changed both their lives forever. Their story continues to inspire people around the world, proving that sometimes the most powerful acts of service happen not when we follow the rules perfectly, but when we have the courage to follow our hearts.